Europe once stood in ruins. From the cliffs of Normandy to the bombed-out streets of Warsaw, to the occupied villages of Norway. On May 8, 1945, we breathed again. We fought together, from every corner of Europe, side by side, against tyranny. We believed the fight was over, that democracy had been restored, that freedom had been secured for all time. Our leaders promised solidarity, a society where no one stood above and no one was left behind. But that promise did not keep itself, because freedom does not die in a single moment, it fades through distraction, through manipulation, through the stories we stop telling. What happened in Norway is happening again, across all of Europe. This is our story, a reminder to every democracy that the promise we made in 1945 can still be lost. After the war, Europe stood together, not just in victory but in rebuilding. Across the continent, new leaders emerged with a shared vision. Clement Attlee in Britain, who gave working families health care for the first time. Alcide de Gasperi in Italy, who rebuilt a republic on democratic values. Robert Schuman in France, who spoke of European solidarity before it had a name. And Einar Gerhardsen in Norway, who lifted a small, occupied nation with the words Alt for Norge, everything for the people, everything for the nation. Different languages, different flags, but one vision. A Europe where no one stood above, and no one was left behind. They promised work for every hand, a home for every family, and safety for every life. And in the northern corner of Europe, a model emerged that would inspire the world, the Scandinavian welfare state. Norway, together with Sweden and Denmark, built societies founded on trust, equality, and social security. Norway became wealthy. The model was a success because of the promise they kept that no citizen would stand alone. It was called the Scandinavian model, a balance of freedom and solidarity, of opportunity and protection. It was not perfect. It was never finished. But it was real. For a moment in history, we believed we had secured it. We called it democracy. We called it Europe's post-war promise. As the decades passed, Europe began to change. The promises of solidarity and equality slowly gave way to market logic as new public management swept across the continent. Hospitals became businesses. Schools became brands. Citizens became customers. In Britain, the National Health Service was cut apart, piece by piece. In Germany, public services were privatized and sold to the highest bidder. And in Norway, the small welfare state that once stood for equality turned into a corporate manager of its own society. The Scandinavian model, once admired, began to erode under the pressure of profit and efficiency. Politics across Europe replaced responsibility with branding. Leaders learned to sell messages, not solutions. And the people? They were no longer citizens to serve, but markets to manage. Europe's post-war promise began to fade into the background as the marketplace moved into every part of our lives. And in that empty space, the global networks were waiting. While Europe sold public service to the market, a new power emerged. Not nations, not communities, but global networks with no voters, no borders, and no accountability. They spoke of climate, of sustainability, of justice, the United Nations, the European Union, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, promising to solve global problems. And yes, those problems are real, but who gave them the right to govern us? Slowly, power shifted from national parliaments to unelected councils and corporate alliances. In Norway, it happened too, a small, sovereign democracy, once standing on the promise of everything for Norway, now following agendas set far beyond its borders. We were warned by history that when power becomes faceless, we are ruled not by people, but by systems without resistance. And while we were told it was for the greater good, our democracies became subcontractors in a global plan. When power grows distant, it must build stories to keep us believing, stories we are not allowed to question, stories we are not allowed to challenge. We used to call it propaganda. Today it's called public relations, reputation management, strategic communication. But make no mistake, it's the same old tool dressed in modern language. Across Europe, governments, media, and global networks began shaping what you are allowed to believe. You were told what to think and warned what not to say. Climate denier, conspiracy theorist, threat to democracy. You weren't challenged. You were dismissed. In Norway, as in Britain, Germany, and France, narrative managers replaced journalists. Social media platforms labeled dissent as dangerous. Traditional media stopped asking questions. And citizens learned to silence themselves just to stay safe. But this was only the beginning, because the next move was already in motion. Governance by permanent crisis. Across Europe, while we were told to trust the process, new emergency laws were drafted out of sight, without debate, without consent, in Italy, in France, in Germany, and in Norway. Norway's Civil Protection Act became a case study, passed quietly, hidden in the noise of bigger headlines. It promised safety, it promised preparedness, but it delivered something else. It gave the state the power to force citizens to work, even the disabled, even the elderly. It allowed the state to access your personal health data without your knowledge or consent. Across Europe, similar powers were quietly expanded, always in the name of protection, never in the name of freedom. Hannah Arendt warned us. Ruled by no one, faceless power, moving without accountability. And the media? They said nothing. They let it pass without a single national debate. And so the pattern was set. Crisis justifies everything, and the system. It was just getting started. The crisis made the rules, but information remained the battlefield, because what if people started asking questions? What if they refused to be silent? So the system responded, not with violence, but with labels. Across Europe, you became a misinformer, a threat to public health, a danger to democracy, if you spoke against the narrative. Fact-checkers replaced journalists, algorithms replaced editors, trusted flaggers replaced public debate. In Norway, in Britain, in the EU, this became the new norm. You were allowed to speak, but only if you agreed. Break the line, and you were erased, not by force, but by delegitimization. You learned to filter your thoughts. You learned to stay quiet. Not for truth, but for safety. And the system? It tightened its grip, calling it protection. But even after everything we've been through, we are not powerless. We can still remember, if we close our eyes, we can see the faces of those who stood with us, long before the system changed everything. We can still feel who we are. Our loyalty was never meant for cold systems or distant powers we can't reach. It was meant for each other, for the neighbor who shared what little they had, for the community that held us together, for the nation we gave so much to. We don't need a majority to change this. We need courage, the kind that lives in those who've already carried heavy burdens. We need conviction, from hearts that still refuse to give up, even after all they've faced. It's the kind of courage that carried us through the war, standing side by side against the darkness. And the kind we showed when we rebuilt our homes with tired hands and aching hearts so our children could grow up safe. In Norway they called it Alt for Norge, everything for the people, everything for the nation, a promise passed down through generations, a promise we are called to keep. And now that promise rests in our hands. We must choose again what we are willing to stand for, even if it costs us more than we ever imagined. Once, Europe's leaders stood among the people. They carried the weight of rebuilding, not for profit, but for the future. Today, we are ruled not by leaders, but by managers, managers of systems, managers of narratives, managers of markets. In France, in Germany, in Brussels, and in Norway, leaders like Anna Solberg and Jonas Gahr Støre follow the same script. They do not serve the people. They manage them. Hannah Arendt warned us that the most dangerous systems do not arrive with violence, but with calm and clever words. Europe's post-war promise has been replaced by markets, by global networks, by narrative control. But we still have a choice: to remember, to reclaim, to stand with the people, not the system. Because the future of Europe will be written not in boardrooms, not in Davos, not in algorithms. It will be written by us. We stood side by side when Europe was on its knees. We fought together, from Norway to France, from Britain to Poland, against a system that rose not through violence, but through manipulation, fear, and control. Some will say this is not the 1930s, this is not Germany, and they are right. But the mechanisms are the same: fear, crisis, and labeling. History never repeats itself in the same way, but the patterns do. And now, just like then, it calls for something more, not silence, but action, because the next chapter of Europe's story is not written yet. And what comes next depends on us.